Welcome to Adaptive Management for Conservation. This Adaptive Management for Conservation training program is supported by UNDP with GEF financing. It's delivered by Conservation Management and Community Solutions in partnerships with the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute. The source material is used under a Creative Commons licensing based on original materials developed by the Conservation Measures Partnership and Protected Area Solutions. My name's Philippa Walsh, but I'm normally called Pip. So over the next couple of weeks, together with my colleague Stuart, who will introduce himself next, we're going to be working with you to explore the open standards and help you really understand them better and practice using them. I come from the Blue Mountains, just to the west of Sydney, and have been working in conservation for about the last 30 years. One of the things I've really enjoyed over the last 15 years is working with teams like yours to think about not just the planning, but also how you set up your planning so that you can implement well and then review, adapt and share what you're doing. I'll turn over to Stuart now to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, I'm Stuart Cowell. Just introducing myself, thanks Pip. So I'm based in Tasmania on the small island at the bottom of Australia that you can see on the map. And as Pip says, I work with conservation standards, usually with communities, particularly in the area that we call healthy country planning, which is working with First Nations. And you can see a few photos there of different places I work around the world. That's me on the left-hand side, all rugged up for winter in one of the project areas that I'm in. Probably gets a bit colder there than where you are. I think it was -20 that day. And the town I live in, Hobart, is in the photograph on the top left-hand side. Tasmania is a beautiful island, lots of coastline, which is the photo in the middle. Anyway, it's lovely to be here and I'm looking forward to working with you on the course. Thanks.
So we're going to be using the open standards for the practice of conservation as the basis of what we're talking about with you this week. And these were used to underpin the Living Management Plan guidelines that were put together for you by Fiona Leverington. So what's planning? There shouldn't, I don't think, be a big mystery about planning. It's really about linking where you are today with where you want to be in the future. Your Protected Area Management Plan guidelines set out some context, so they really suggest that what you want your plans for is to guide activities, to help direct the funding you've got, and very importantly, to make sure people understand what's happening and to make sure people have agreed on the future. A lot of plans can be hard to understand, and in that case, they're not really used. Sometimes they're out of date. Certainly not just a problem in Papua New Guinea, it's a problem of big, thick management plans the world over. But what we're doing with you is really coming up with a process so that plans are made with a common approach across the country but can be adapted and tailored to suit particular protected areas and their culture. So some will be more detailed and complex and others will be more simple. The important thing is that we want to help you coming up with plans that are relevant and actively used. So adaptive management, really we're shifting from what people sort of see as a sort of straight line process, the linear process, to sort of thinking about things more in cycles, and you sort of improve things as you go along. So who are some of the key people who've helped come up with this approach? It's a big group called the Conservation Measures Partnership, made up of governments, not-for-profits and funding agencies. And as you can see from this slide, there are open standards projects all over the world in all sorts of different countries used by lots and lots of people in lots and lots of languages. One of the big benefits is that by using this common methodology, we get standard terms to describe the threats and also to describe what we're doing about things. So our approach to adaptive management is the conservation standards, which are open standards, and these really provide kind of a backbone or a template for how you might think about planning. We're going to walk you through the sort of international version of the standards this week, but it's worth bearing in mind that this is something that can really be tweaked and adapted to suit your local circumstances. So in Australia, for example, what we've done is, based on this process, we've actually come up with a system called Healthy Country Planning. And really what we did with that was work with some of our traditional owner groups and just change the language a little bit so it was more accessible and comfortable for people to use, and to add in some thoughts about participation and some of the things we wanted to do to make sure that people's voice was really coming through strongly into a lot of those plans. This slide just shows you the process that was put together for your protected area guidelines. And if you're familiar with those, you'll start seeing that there are a number of elements that are common to your planning system and the open standards. What we'll do now is just walk you through some of the key elements of the open standards and give you a little bit of a taste of what each of those are about. And this will be expanded on further as we walk through the next 9 days and talk about things in more detail. So pre-planning. This is something which it can be a little bit easy to sort of gloss over or not think so much about the importance of, but this step of setting out who needs to be involved, what tasks are done by when, what product do you need at the end, is one of the most fundamental things to get right, or to really put some time into if you want your plan to be implemented. One of the other really key things to have early on is a vision. So I've got this little diagram here with these little spiders at the bottom of a slippery dip saying, if we pull this off, we'll eat like kings. And what we're thinking about here is, what's our big vision? Not sort of what we need to happen over the next couple of years, but what is it that people really are wanting to think about longer term? So again, in your protected area guidelines, this links in with sort of having thought about the story and having thought about people's dreams. The other thing that it's important to have resolved fairly early on is, what's the scope of your plan? So what's in and what's out? What sorts of things are you able to consider, and what sorts of things might you actually put aside for consideration under perhaps a different process? So as I said, tomorrow what we'll be doing is going through each of those 3 steps in more detail and getting each of you in your groups to do some exercises based on your case study, just to have a look at what you've got already in terms of pre-planning that's been done, the vision and the scope. So once we've done that, then we move on to starting to think about what really are some of the more specific things in the plan. So you've got sort of a vision and scope, but to actually make your plan a bit more manageable and easy to deal with, we get you to think about what are called targets. Now, this is where language might get a bit tricky, because sometimes people think of targets as objectives. In this case, we think of targets as the things you care about. So you might think of them as values or assets, that kind of thing. And we get people to think about those in a particular way, so we don't have a list of many targets. It's very hard to make a plan if you've got a list of 100 things you need to look after. So one thing we do with people is just work through and think about, what are some of the things that really need looking after? Can we group them together a bit and look after them that way? Again, we'll be doing some exercises on this, and we'll be using your case studies to do that. The example we've got up on the screen is some work done by one of our groups in Northern Australia. So the sorts of things that they wanted to focus on in their plan and that they chose it as targets were cultural practice, the dugong, right way fire, so a very specific type of cultural practice, the bush food, threatened species, and water places. The other thing you might notice here is people have used their own names, their own language names for some of these things, because that really can help with communicating the plan. So it's worth thinking as you go through what your targets are, but also making sure that you've got them named in a way that the people who live in that place and who are implementing the plan really relate to those things as well. Once we've thought about targets, one of the next steps we do is we really ask groups to think about what's the health of that target. How's it going? And that's to help us really understand. If we said planning was how you get from where you are now to where you want to be, it's really making sure we understand fairly well where we are now. But it also gives us, in the end, we hope, a scorecard that looks a little bit like this, where you can see pretty clearly some things need a lot more attention than other things. So if something is still in very good health or good health, we might be able to sort of not focus on that as much. But if something's in poor health, that's something we really want to focus on pretty quickly. So again, a lot of what we do in the conservation standards that might be a little bit different to the way people have done planning so far is we really want to help teams prioritise. So you look across things, but then you're saying, okay, we might have a longer list, but let's look at what are the things that need our most urgent help. What we like to do when we're doing this health assessment is also incorporate traditional ecological knowledge in the health assessments. So when the conservation standards were first put together, there was a lot more emphasis on the sort of Western science approach to thinking about health, but it's very possible, and in fact we've been doing it a lot, to think about how you might actually put in more cultural aspects of health as well. So once we've got our list of the things we care about, the targets, and we've got an understanding of how healthy they are, the next thing we do is start to think a little bit about goals. And the reason we do that is that goals are the way we actually think about solutions. So moving from thinking about problems to solutions, and they really set out what you want to accomplish. Now, how does that sort of health rating fit in here? If you've got something which has been rated as in poor health, your goal might be to get it to fair. If it's rated in fair, your goal might be to get it to good. So it also helps you think about what is the next level you need to get to. Because sometimes if we're not able to say what's poor, what's fair, and what's good, the danger we have is that we might not set our goals so that we're actually getting that shift from, say, poor to fair. So it really just helps us, again, it gives us a bit of a framework to also set up SMART goals. I know you've got those, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time-bound, but we really want to get those things so that you can actually measure your goals and see whether you're making a difference. So once we've got the things we care about, a bit of a sense of how healthy they are, we've started to formulate where we want to be in the future, we actually then come and think about what are the threats. Now again, it might seem a little bit different to the way you do things in other things. Often people jump to thinking about threats first, but we really wanted to get that baseline in place so you can think about where health is now, so that when you're thinking about threats, you're really thinking about threats going forward, not necessarily the threats that have already happened, because you should have accounted for the threats that have already happened in your health rating. And again, threats, pretty straightforward. I think you'd be familiar with many of the threats that are listed up here on this diagram. But similarly to our health ranking, what we want to do is to really think about which threats are applicable to which of the targets, because it's not always going to be, a threat is not going to be applicable to all targets, or if it's applicable to a lot of the targets, it may not apply at the same level. So we really want to have a way of prioritising threats. Again, if you start with a very long list of threats, as in this case, 16 threats, it can be a little bit hard when you're saying, okay, what do we focus on first? So this is all about saying, what are the ones we want to focus on first? How do we pick those out? Again, you might have some where they're not ranked highly across all of your targets, but you might focus on something where it's only highly ranked against one of the targets, but it's important that you look at it then. The next thing we do is then start to think about bringing in sort of what's happening in the world around us. So we call this situation analysis, but we're really thinking about how do all these things connect? How do our threats connect to our conservation targets? And then starting to think about, well, what is it that's actually causing that threat to operate? Or what is it that's causing that target to stay in poor health? And we do that by thinking about indirect threats or contributing factors. But at this stage, we also like to take a bit of a more optimistic view and start thinking, are there any opportunities in this situation as well? So we do a little bit of thinking about what's currently happening around us. So in this case, we've got a marine example. This team has picked out a couple of things they're interested in. So the fisheries-based livelihoods and the coastal wetlands. The big threat is conversion for agriculture. And they've started to think about, well, what are the things that are driving that? So that might be demand for food. The demand for food might be going up because you're getting an increased population down on the coast. But then you might have an opportunity which is around increasing demand for sustainably produced produce. So just a couple of different ways of thinking about things. And when you have a look at this, just think about how a strategy might fit into that. So in this case, there's an opportunity around that increasing demand for sustainably produced food. So a strategy to actually work with agricultural corporations to increase adoption of environmental standards is an option that could be used. And you can see how things fit together. Once we've started to develop our strategies and we've actually prioritised them a little bit, the next thing we do is we actually have a bit of a think about, the logic. How do we get from our strategy through to the results we want? So what are the sort of interim results in the middle? So if we look at the example we've got here, it's a marine example. If what we're looking for is healthy marine turtles, and the threat or the problem is that there's a lot of bycatch problems. In this case, this team has decided to test and promote a certain type of hooks to reduce the bycatch, and they've had a look and said what's needed, and they've said, well, we'll need to demonstrate the effectiveness of circle hooks. If we demonstrate the effectiveness of circle hooks, fishers will recognise the advantage of circle hooks. If fishers recognise the advantages of circle hooks and they can get the circle hooks for free, fishermen will accept and use the circle hooks. If they accept and use them, bycatch mortality should be reduced and we'll get more turtles. That's sort of just the logic of thinking that through. You can also add, the yellow boxes here are sort of starting to think about what are the activities you need to do as you go along. And we tend to use this results chain diagram then for a lot of our work. Sort of we can think about what's our measurable goal for the turtles, what's the indicator to understand whether we're reaching that goal, what method would we use, when do we want to use it, who's responsible, etc. And similarly, we can think about measurable objectives for some of those other results and indicators as well. Now that all looks pretty technical. So we do have different ways of showing this with the community. So here's an example from one of our, again, our Northern Australia program, just showing it in a little bit different format. So we say we light fires to burn the country. So the grass is going to come back to rejuvenate and all the animals will come back to that burnt patch. The animals like the hill kangaroo and rock wallabies will come back to this area. So old people that go out hunting will feel happy again to see them. So we've got that sort of modern approach, but then we can also do it as much more of a story approach when we're working with audiences that aren't so comfortable with the sort of boxes and arrows type of diagram. Once we've got that bit of, I guess, what you'd call a logic or a theory of change worked out through the results chains, then we get back into thinking about things like work plans, monitoring plans, and then our adaptation piece. So when we're thinking about adaptation, if we had our vision or targets sort of linking down through objectives, strategies to actions, we're really thinking about our vision on one side, and we're starting to think, how do we measure those things on the way back up the other side? So down the one side we have healthy country, an objective for 2025, some implementation thoughts, and some very specific actions. We can monitor those actions through recording where we've done work. We can generate a map that shows our key areas of work over time. We can then demonstrate more control of the pest species, and then we're actually going to start looking at, is country healthier once we've done that? Every step can have a spatial or a mapping element. So it can be quite useful as a way of showing people how things are working, to, I guess, map the scope, the vision, and some of your sort of targets. You can map your threats. You can use GIS analysis to develop and refine your strategies. When you're actually implementing things, you can also generate maps that show where you've been and what you've done, what's changed. You can use those to reflect and analyse and adapt what you're doing, and also use them to share. There are quite a lot of guidance and training materials, and a lot of them are available through a set of interlinked websites. So there's an open standards website, there's a website put together by the partnership who've developed the open standards, there's the Conservation Coaches Network, and there's some specialised software. The sorts of things you might find on those websites are guidance and training materials. Some of those we've actually provided in the Google Classroom space. The Conservation Coaches Network, so that's a whole lot of people like Stuart and myself who spend their time working with teams, basically to help you apply the standards and to help you apply them well. So a little bit like a sports coach, but for conservation. We touched on the fact there's some specialised software. At this stage, we're not going to go into detail of that software with you, but if anybody's particularly interested, both Stuart and I use it and are happy to talk to people about it. So what are we going to do across this? We're going to introduce you all to the open standards process. Importantly, apart from just introducing you to it, we're actually going to give you quite a lot of opportunity to use the conservation standards and to use them on your statements of management intent and on projects which you're continuing to do it. One of the things, and I think some of you touched on this in your biographies, is we're also always looking to expand the circle of practitioners or expand the circle of people who are using the standards. So we very much, I guess, welcome new people, but also encourage you to see yourself as a part of a group of people using this, and to see yourself as part of a network who broadly are pretty happy to help each other use things, because that's, I think, one of the real benefits about using something where there is a whole network of people worldwide who use this. Finally, what do you need to produce at the end of this course? So you're not going to get to just sit around and listen to us talking to you like this presentation. We're going to get you through the workshop to basically prepare a bit of a plan based on the session. So you should sort of, at the end of it, have some objectives and actions for a particular focal issue or theme from your plans. Each team will have 25 minutes to present their plan and do some questions and answers. And we'll aim to get you to identify focal issues or targets, their viability, key threats, come up with a logical and powerful results chain, have some goals and measurable objectives linked to that results chain, have actions linked to those, and have some specified implementation requirements. So that's the practical bit. The other thing to help us and to help you think about what you've learned is we'd like you to really actively think about what have you learnt through applying this process. What do you think it will mean as you try and apply it back in the real world outside this course? Because that's one of the really important things for you to think through. And in fact, we'd like you to think that through every day, because if we can, Stuart and I would like to answer any questions you've got or any concerns you've got as we go through the course. We always have ground rules for our workshops, and we thought we'd have some pretty similar rules for this web-based workshop. So what we want is for all of you to participate, but we don't want just one or two people to dominate. And that's a little bit linked to the boss-free zone. So we really want to hear from all of you. Another thing is we want what we call tough love, but with a smile. So we want you to be really thinking about the idea and really sort of thinking very carefully about what you understand, what you don't, sort of really interrogating and thinking strategically about things. We'd really like you to be present in the room, and if you can, avoid going out to do little bits of work or to have side conversations. And then really importantly, we'd love you all to have fun.